Hi everyone, this is Lauren from the Museum of Natural and Cultural History, and I'd like to welcome all of you to the museum's first virtual talk. I hope you're all staying well, and I look forward to the time when we can all safely gather again at the museum. Before we get started, I have a couple of museum updates that I'd like to share with you. First up, the museum has a new Museums from Home page on our website that helps you stay connected and stay curious while the museum is closed to the public. From this page, you can explore the museum's online collections galleries, as well as discover family-friendly activities, crafts, and videos. After tonight's talk, I encourage you to head on over to the museum's website and check it out. And then also coming up on May 6th at 6 p.m., the museum will host our monthly Ideas on Tap program virtually right here on Facebook. I want to give a special shout out to Viking Braggot Company. They normally host our Ideas on Tap program at their Southtown location. And although we might not be able to meet there this month, fear not. They do offer both delivery and takeout of food and drink, including their braggots. So just head to their website for more details. And then for May's program, we'll be joined by Courtney Cox, Assistant Professor of Race and Sport at the University of Oregon, for a look at the sports industry's use of quantitative data to predict and enhance athletic performance, and what it all means for athletes from the weekend warrior to the Golden State Warriors. So pick up some braggot and join us on May 6th right here on Facebook. And then just a few notes about tonight's program. As I mentioned at the beginning, this is our first virtual talk, so I hope that you'll forgive any hiccups that we may have along the way. If you have questions for Eric, please use the comments feature on the live stream. I will collect your questions throughout the program, and we'll get to as many as we can at the end. We'll also be posting a link to a survey in the comments section at the end of this program. And I hope that you'll consider taking a moment to click over and fill that out. It'll help us improve our virtual programs in the future. So, and with that, it's now my pleasure to introduce our speaker for the evening, Eric Ward. Eric is the Executive Director of Western States Center and a national expert on the relationship between hate violence and preserving democratic institutions, governance, and inclusive societies. Since his civil rights career began in the late 1980s, Eric has worked with community groups, government and business leaders, and human rights advocates throughout the country to expose and counter white nationalist hate groups, protect vulnerable communities, and make our democracy more inclusive. For the locals who have tuned in tonight, Eric founded and directed a community project to expose and counter hate groups and respond to bigoted violence with the Community Alliance of Lane County from 1990 to 1994. So we're excited to have Eric joining us this evening for his talk, Organized Bigotry, A History of Hate Groups in Oregon. And with that, I'll turn it over to Eric.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad to be here with you all. My name is Eric Ward, and again, Executive Director of Western State Center based in Portland, Oregon. You know, as a former student at the University of Oregon and a longtime resident and community member of Eugene and Lane County, really excited to be here with you this evening, even though we are talking about a very difficult conversation. I hope everyone is well. And you know, today we want to talk a little bit about the history of hate groups in Oregon. We are all very familiar with the recent case of individual who attacked three men who intervened in a hate crime on the Portland Max train about 3 years ago. Two of those individuals were murdered by the white nationalist. He was attempting to target two young Black women who were also riding the train. And it really raised the spotlight on the history of hate groups in Oregon. But it's not the first time. And I think it's important for us to both understand the history of Oregon and the history of white nationalism. It has a significant impact, not only on vulnerable communities such as immigrants, African Americans, Latinos, and others. It also has an impact on the entire community. in terms of economy, in terms of the fact that most of the victims of white nationalist violence are not people of color, but white individuals who are targeted in hate crimes, and other acts. So today we want to explore the history of hatred in Oregon, talk a little bit about the white nationalist movement, and then talk about lessons that we have learned and how we might respond. And then we'll take questions. All stories start with a personal history. I moved to Eugene, Oregon in 1986 from Los Angeles, California. I was a young 20-something who was involved in the punk scene in LA and had two friends who were moving up to attend the University of Oregon. I decided to move up there with them. 5 of us did. We moved from Los Angeles to Eugene, Oregon, and it was a huge change for someone like me. I remember when one of my friends first asked if I would move to Eugene with them. And I remember looking them in the eye with the love a friend may have for the other, and said to myself, why would I ever move to Eugene? And I'm pretty sure I didn't say Oregon, but Oregon. I can laugh about that now, but it was actually embarrassing how little I knew about Oregon. How little did I know? Well, I began to ask my friends questions, such as if there were McDonald's, was there cable television in Oregon? Now, mind you, this is the 80s. I also remember asking my friends things like if there was running water and electricity. I remember that at the time, if you had been able to look at my brain, what you would have seen me visualizing was San Francisco, a lot of trees, and the Space Needle that wasn't even in Oregon, but in Seattle, Washington. Why did I have that? Because I had very little information. And because I had little information, I relied on stereotypes of things that I thought might represent Oregon. Hatred and bigotry in our society functions in the same way. Stereotypes are most powerful when we don't have real data, real information, and real relationships that help us counter those things. Stereotypes are actually quite natural, much more natural than we like to admit. Stereotypes come from lack of information and lack of experience. I'm glad I ignored those stereotypes and moved to Oregon. Oregon has been my home. I have said, even when I lived in Chicago, even when I lived in New York City, I always woke up facing west. I spent most of my time on vacation back here in Oregon amongst friends and amongst family. I'm glad to be back in Oregon, and I'm glad to have learned that lesson around hate crimes. I started this work in response to hate groups and hate crimes for a very specific reason. In 1988, there was the murder of an Ethiopian student in Portland, Oregon, by the name of Mulugeta Sarah. Mulugeta Sarah was a student attending college, and on his way home being dropped off by friends one night, they were attacked by a group of racist skinheads who ended up murdering Mulugeta Sarah by beating him to death with baseball bats. Not much different than what we just faced a few years later. The target of an individual, not for anything they may have done, but who they represented. It was a real wake-up call, not only for me, but others in Oregon as well. But before we move into this, I think it's important to understand that the history of Oregon in terms of hatred is the history of white supremacy in America. What do I mean when I say white supremacy? When I talk about white supremacy, I mean a system of discrimination and harassment. It is both a historical system and a present-day system. White supremacy is how our society was organized. It was based off of 3 core ideas. The first was anti-Black racism. The second was the stolen land of indigenous people and their resources. And the third, that is not often talked about, was the control of sexuality, primarily women. This is how our society was constructed. Now, I want to take a second and have everyone take a really deep breath. That's a lot to carry. And I think there's something important for all of us to remember. None of us are responsible for how our society was constructed, right? None of us were here when that took place. We are certainly responsible to make sure that our society moves to a place where it provides opportunity, fairness, and equity for all of our members of society. But none of us are responsible for the construction of white supremacy. But white supremacy is the system that we had. And it was based off of these three ideas. But there was an important component to those three ideas. It was that white superiority was the goal of those three concepts: anti-Black racism, the idea that the resources and the lands of Native people could just be taken, and the control of women's sexuality without their consent. The idea was to create this idea that the highest form in society was a white Christian male who owned property. That is simply how our society was constructed. Certainly things have changed, and we will get to that in a second, but I want to talk a little bit about how the history of white supremacy played out in Oregon. Next slide. The Northwest is an example of exclusion by design. And we see some of the same patterns that I just spoke about that shaped the United States. The first is the the genocide against indigenous people here in Oregon and throughout the Pacific Northwest. This was a regional ambition, and it still persists in contemporary America, and it persists in Oregon. We can look at much of the data around infant mortality, graduation rates, arrest rates, and understand that a disparity exists in terms of race, right, and in terms of resources. Next slide. Not only anti-Indian bigotry, but also the Black exclusion laws that arose during Oregon's history. We are all familiar that there is a small Black population in Oregon because Blacks were not allowed to reside in the state of Oregon. That this was a territorial law, Black exclusion laws. When Oregon entered the Union, when the territory of Oregon entered the Union, it entered as a free state, not a slave state. Now, while we may begin to take some pride in the fact that we chose not to be a slave state, I think it's important to understand why Oregon chose to be a free state. It wasn't that it was opposed to slavery. It was that it was opposed to Black people residing within the territory of Oregon at all. It wasn't literally until around World War II that you began to see a Black population take place and take root as residents of Oregon. When we ask ourselves why there is such a small Black population in Oregon, it's not because Black people don't like the environment of Oregon. It is because there were laws that purposely kept Black people out through the threat of violence. But Oregon also has its own history of hate groups that isn't recent. In the 1920s and 30s, Oregon had the largest Ku Klux Klan west of the Mississippi. It was a Klan that dominated politics of the state and also local governments. Klan was primarily focused on discrimination against Native people, Asians, Catholics, and Jews. It was a large social movement in comparison to the alt-right and white nationalist activity that we see presently. Eventually, the Klan was held accountable and melted away. But largely, the Klan in Oregon disappeared because it was corrupt and it exploited its members for economic profit. Next slide. So what changed in Oregon? What made the Klan and other hate groups go away? Well, to get to that understanding, we first have to understand a new concept that I want to introduce: white nationalism. White nationalism is different from white supremacy, and I want to say that again. white nationalism is not the same phenomena as white supremacy. If white supremacy is a system of discrimination and exploitation, white nationalism is about ethnic cleansing. If white supremacy was about controlling vulnerable communities in this country, white nationalism is about ridding this country of those populations. Where does white nationalism arise from? Well, white nationalism is a direct reaction to something that happened in the 1960s. And that was called and known as the 1960s Civil Rights Movement, that was largely active in the South. We may all be familiar with the 1960s Civil Rights Movement because of names like Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks, and others. The 1960s Civil Rights Movement was a significant movement. It was significant in the fact that it ended white supremacy under the rule of law. Let me say that again. The Civil Rights Movement of the 1960s ended white supremacy under the rule of law. It meant that white supremacy was no longer de jure. Previous to that victory in the 1960s, white supremacy was simply the law of the land, right? There was very little conflict over whether white supremacy was the rule of law for those who could participate in society. It was how culture was formed, it was how economy was formed, it was how political society was formed. Believing in white supremacy, the idea that some people were superior and some people were inferior based off of their skin color, was no different than breathing air, right? You didn't have to convince people of it. It was based off the idea that white people were superior and that Black people and other people of color were inferior. It wasn't really debated. So along comes these African Americans who are seen as inferior, who defeat the white supremacist movement under the rule of law. Now, I'm not saying white supremacy doesn't exist anymore. It is certainly de facto. It certainly still has influence, but it is a contested terrain in America today. And that is because of this 1960s civil rights movement. So again, to revisit, what is the difference between white supremacy and white nationalism? White supremacy is a system that is in place and has been in place. It is a system that I would argue is actually eroding due to, in large part, to the work of a majority of Americans who no longer believe in separate and equal, but equal, who no longer believe in inferiority in that way. White nationalism is a social movement that arose in direct response to the victory of the civil rights movement. Why? Well, let's talk about this for a little bit. Imagine for a second, you believe in Jim Crow. You believe Blacks are inferior. You believe that you are superior just based off of your skin color. You also believe that these are accepted mores, right, and cultural prompts in society that simply should be. How then do you explain that you lost to folks you see as inferior? Do you all of a sudden discard white superiority and say, well, I guess Blacks are equal after all? I guess they are on an equal plane with us. Not likely. White superiority isn't discarded in that simply. It is unconscious as much as it is conscious. But an answer needed to happen. If you were an arch segregationist, you had to understand why you lost. And it was in that understanding that white nationalism began to surface. Arch segregationists were never going to admit that they lost to African Americans in a political struggle. And so they began to look for another scapegoat. And they began to borrow from an idea that they had heard from two places. The first was from a man by the name of Henry Ford, who invented the automobile. Henry Ford owned a newspaper called the Dearborn Independent, and it was sold through all of his car dealerships across the country. Henry Ford was an inventor. Henry Ford was a capitalist, but Henry Ford was also an anti-Semite. Henry Ford believed in a Jewish conspiracy. In the early 1920s, he was exposed to a forged document called the Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion. It was a forged document that purported to tell of a global conspiracy by a secret order of Jewish leaders to control the world. This book was circulated, this forged document was circulated in France during the Dreyfus Affair in the early 1900s. It was created and forged by Russian secret police who were afraid of the rise of democracy in Europe. The book purports to tell of a gathering of Jewish elders in a cemetery at midnight who plot the control of the world. It is a book that has been, a story that has been retold and sold across the world, even though it has been proven to be a forgery. It has fueled narrative conspiracies both in pop culture and in mass hysteria. We know that under Nazi Germany, that the Nazis published over 24 different editions of the protocols. It is a powerful narrative, even though it is a false narrative. Henry Ford believed in the protocols, and he republished it in his newspaper as the International Jew, right? And this conspiracy spread around America. As veterans were returning home from World War II, many in the South remembered this narrative, not only from Henry Ford, but from things they had heard in Germany and what was post-Nazified America. The protocols were very powerful and provided a very easy answer for arch segregationists who were trying to understand how they lost to Black folks. The answer became that they lost to Jews, not Black folks. Anti-Semitism became a core component of the white nationalist movement, which was a shift in evolution. It didn't mean anti-Semitism didn't exist in America. It meant that anti-Semitism began to become organized in a new way in the United States. What had once been primarily a religious form of bigotry became a racialized form of bigotry. Jews were no longer seen as a religious other, but a racial other, not inferior, but almost a conspiratorial existential race that was plotting to take control of the white race. That became the answer not only for the success of the civil rights movement for segregationists, but a host of other issues, whether we were talking about labor rights, LGBTQ rights, women's rights in this country. Everything became the source of a Jewish conspiracy. This conspiracy theory continues to generate the white nationalist movement into violence and into organizing. For all intents and purposes, white nationalists see themselves in an existential war with the Jewish community. And even attacks on people of color by the white nationalist movement is largely driven by anti-Semitism. Whether we are talking about the attacks at the Jewish synagogue, at the Tree of Life in Pittsburgh, at the Tree of Life synagogue, or the attacks on Latinos in El Paso, or the attempted attack on 2 African-American women, one who was Muslim here in Portland, Oregon, on that MAX train one day, white nationalists believe that they are at war with the Jewish community and that people of color, gays and lesbians, women, and liberals are merely puppets. Anti-Semitism is not only a threat to the Jewish community, but it is also a threat to those of us who seek legitimate legitimate correction of grievance from our governments. Because this conspiracy argues that minorities have no legitimate grievances. The white nationalist movement is still on the rise. It is not in control of our government, though it certainly has influence, and it is certainly tied to violent acts. But comparing white supremacy, the system, to the rise of this social movement is like comparing a Big Mac and a cow because they are both made out of beef. It is important not to conflate white supremacy with white nationalism. It is important for us to understand, right, that white nationalism is a social movement that also doesn't believe white supremacy is the future. It does not look back longingly at the days of Gone with the Wind. It is a movement that seeks to overthrow the United States of America in order to create an all-white ethnic country, free of Jews and people of color. Next slide. In Oregon, it's important for us to understand that we also have a history of white nationalism. White nationalism begins in earnest in the Pacific Northwest in the late 1980s, early 1990s. When an individual from California, just like me, from Southern California by coincidence, also decides to move to the Pacific Northwest. Instead of moving to Oregon, though, he moves to Idaho, to a place called Hayden Lake. At Hayden Lake, he reestablishes a church called the Church of Jesus Christ Christian Aryan Nations. The Aryan Nations taught three core beliefs. The first was that Jews were the literal children of Satan. The second was that people of color were subhuman or chattel, meaning no different than cattle in the field, and that white Northern Europeans were the true descendants of the lost tribes of Israel. Richard Butler, who headed the Aryan Nations, saw the Pacific Northwest as the new Israel for white people and called on white nationalist leaders and organizations to relocate to the Pacific Northwest and Intermountain states. Numbers, right? Dozens of organizations and individuals responded to that call. From groups like the American Front to chapters like White Aryan Resistance, the list goes on. The Aryan Nations also produced a document called the Northwest Imperative. The Northwest Imperative sought to create this Aryan homeland through violence and intimidation. This created a series of acts that occurred in the Pacific Northwest, including the murder, assassination of a radio talk show host by the name of Alan Berg in Denver, Colorado. He was a Jewish talk show host on KOA radio who often matched wits with the white nationalist movement. Eventually, they got tired of him and assassinated him outside of his home. But also bombings and armored car robberies. From groups like The Order to small publishing houses, the white nationalist movement began to take root in the Pacific Northwest. From Ruby Ridge standoff in Idaho, right, to the Oklahoma City bombing, to the Freeman standoff in Montana, the white nationalist movement was flexing its muscles, learning how to organize, learning how to intimidate, and learning how to sharpen their narrative. They began to drop hard language like the international Jewish conspiracy and simply inserted things like the international banking conspiracy. They no longer began to talk about their hatred of Blacks, but focused on things like affirmative action or immigration as code words around race. How did that work and why did that work? Well, quickly, I just want to reflect on someone who is not from the Pacific Northwest, not from Oregon, but had a huge influence on the development of white nationalism in the Pacific Northwest. His name was David Duke, and you might be familiar with the name. He's a former Grand Wizard, Grand Titan, Grand something of the Ku Klux Klan. Before, David Duke was also a bona fide neo-Nazi. He also was a Holocaust denier. David Duke began to run for public office in the 80s. I want to be clear. David Duke ran as a Republican, but he also ran as a Democrat. He also ran as an independent. David Duke ran for office so many times that I'm not going to go into the details. But there's a dynamic that came from David Duke running for office and a lesson that he learned and shared with the white nationalist movement. When he first began running for office, people were outraged. They couldn't believe that a white nationalist had the gall to run for public office. People protested, they wrote letters, they mobilized. David Duke lost. He turned around and ran for office again and lost. He turned around and ran for office again and won a seat in the Louisiana State Legislature. Then David Duke turned around and ran for governor of Louisiana. And while he lost the vote for governor, he did win the majority of the white vote in the early 90s. People were completely perplexed. How did David Duke move from the margins to the mainstream? And so folks do what they do when they panic, which is a lot of polling and focus groups. But the fact is all of us on this seminar today know exactly what happened. The fact of the matter is that David Duke had bombarded the public with his ideas for so long that they no longer seemed extreme, right? David Duke has a book called My Awakening, and it is his autobiography. Now, if My Awakening sounds similar to Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf, My Life, David Duke tells us that that's purely coincidental. But the fact of the matter is that David Duke shares what his core issues were when everyone was calling him a hardcore racist. They were stopping non-white immigration into the United States, passing English-only legislation, right, ending affirmative action, and controlling women's sexuality. These are now mainstream debates in our country. Now, David Duke would say that he has had a huge influence and pats himself on the back. But the fact of the matter is that David Duke had a little help, and that help came from us. David Duke learned an important lesson, that we as Americans, we as Oregonians, don't like overt bigotry. But if you take that bigotry and you put it into code, we will drink it down, as my niece says, like Kool-Aid. How does that work? And I want to give everyone an example because I may have put you to sleep right now or you need a nap. I'm going to have everyone who is watching this close your eyes for a second. And I'm going to give you a word, and I want you to imagine what this word looks like, what it sounds like. Here comes the word. Immigration. And you can come back now. When we are being honest with one another, right? When we are putting kind of our conscious self aside, I can tell you one thing. When the majority of people hear the word immigration, they are not visualizing Canadians coming down from the north, nor are they visualizing the large undocumented Polish population in Chicago, nor are they visualizing the large Irish populations in undocumented Irish populations in San Francisco, New York, and Boston, to name a few. What people are visualizing are brown-skinned people coming up from the South, hopping fences as the media often portrays, even though this is not how most people overstay their visas, in the United States. The fact of the matter is that David Duke figured out that he could have a debate on race without ever having to mention the word race. He merely had to start using terms like affirmative action, illegal immigration, and other code words. That these dog whistles would result in the same type of visualization and stereotypes similar to the ones I had about Oregon that I mentioned earlier. David Duke was able to refine the white nationalist movement so that it could prepare itself to mainstream its message. But not only mainstream its message, but begin to practice what we call ballot box bigotry. That he was expanding the movement to not only focus on physical violence, but also electoral success. This became important because as we got into the 90s, the white nationalist movement began to act in very destructive ways. From the bombing of Oklahoma City, to hate crimes, to mass shootings, the federal government began to crack down on the violence of the white nationalist movement in America, and it began to decline and go underground. But then something else happened that gave rise, again, to the white nationalist movement. Next slide. The election of Barack Obama created one of the openings for the white nationalist movement to reassert itself, to become part of a larger coalition. The backlash against Barack Obama and his 2 terms in office were quite significant. On the day that Barack Obama won the elections for the presidency of the United States, hate crimes began to skyrocket in the United States, including here in Oregon. The racist backlash to the election of Barack Obama was paired with anti-government sentiment that had been promoted by the white nationalist movement for quite some time. But new groups began to arise, such as the Oath Keepers, 3 Percenters, constitutional sheriffs, and peace officers. We began to see an ascension of the patriot wing of the white nationalist movement. When I say patriot, I want to be clear about something. These are not patriots who love the country, who love our rule of law, who understand democratic practice. These are folks who have co-opted the term patriotism when what they mean is an ultra form of nationalist authoritarianism. That is, might is right, that doesn't care about the collective responsibility of a community, but uses intimidation and bullying tactics in order to try to circumvent democratic practice. At its root, it is the idea that even though we live in a society where we have collective responsibility to one another as Americans, their attitude is if we don't get our way completely, we will not only take our ball, but we will beat you over the head with it. These patriot groups have been quite active and intimidating, whether we are talking about the Malheur standoff that occurred in Oregon several years ago, or if we were talking about the recent focus on intimidating law enforcement, medical workers, and even patients who are trying to keep order in a society that is dealing with a pandemic health crisis. The Patriot Movement, not actually being patriots, has 3 core beliefs. The first is that there are 2 types of citizens in this society. There is the organic citizen who derives their rights from God, in their own words. And then there is the 14th Amendment citizen who derives their rights from the Constitution. I will let everyone figure out who's who in that definition. But it also means that this is a dual type of citizenship in their minds. The idea that there is a group of folks who have a higher set of rights, right? And that there are folks who don't. It is really a modified, coded language for 2 types of citizens in, quote, separate but equal. But it's not just 2 types of citizens. The Patriot Movement also believes that the United States is not a democracy, but properly a republic. They draw a false distinguishing definition between the idea that we actually have a republic that is run through democratic practice, and that has been the evolving nature of the United States since its inception. They are anti-democratic, small d, in the sense that they believe and are open to authoritarian forms of government. The third piece around the Patriot Movement, though, is this, that it doesn't believe in anything past the Declaration of Independence, the introduction to the Constitution, and the first 10 amendments. The Patriot Movement argues that everything after the 10th Amendment is illegal and that they are not subject to obeying those constitutional laws and rights. The Patriot Movement has shown its violence in terms of the Freeman standoff and a host of other issues that have put law enforcement and community members in harm's way over the last 2 decades. But it is the Patriot Movement that made the bridge between the hardcore white nationalist movement and to conservative organizations such as the Tea Party and others that were mobilizing in resistance to Donald Trump. In short, The backlash against Barack Obama created a bridge that began to pair the white nationalist movement with other elements of the right wing in America. Next slide. But the white nationalist movement was still on the fringe. But the 2016 election of Donald Trump changed that. Through that election process, the white nationalist movement was able to move from the margins to the mainstream of that coalition. It was no longer a fringe, embarrassing element, but it became part of the core organizing mechanism of the Trump campaign and then the Trump administration. Many individuals like Gorka and Steve Bannon were forced out of the White House administration because of their close ties to white nationalists. But not all. Individuals like Steve Miller and others also found themselves entwined both within white nationalist circles, but also with influence within the White House. This was really a coming of age period for the white nationalist movement. Not only did we see them assert themselves electorally, but also through violence. White nationalists have been responsible for more acts of terror in the United States than nearly any other extremist group that one might think of. In the last 3 years, hundreds of Americans have lost their lives to white nationalist violence, including here in Oregon. Next slide. But there is a lesson from history. And the lesson is this. It is to understand first that hate groups don't come to our communities bringing racism, Islamophobia, homophobia, or other forms of bigotry with them. They simply organize the bigotry that already exists. It is also important to understand that white supremacy has a system, often provides oxygen for the white nationalist movement. I will give you a case in point. About 3 years ago, there was a large alt-right white nationalist demonstration in Portland, Oregon. At this demonstration, there were protesters and counter-protesters. There was an individual who was an alt-right activist, a young person, who was being interviewed by someone who just had a camera and who was shouting at him, like just shouting questions at him. And the person shouting questions was saying to this alt-right activist, "Why are you here? No one wants you here," right? The mayor doesn't want you here. These protesters don't want you here. Why are you here, right? And the young alt-right activist said to the person holding the camera, he said, "Yeah, I've heard that too, that we're not wanted. But the fact of the matter is that we live in a city, right, with a shrinking Black population," and he meant Portland, Oregon, "by both percentage and whole number." He said, "You can say you don't want me here, you don't want us here. But the fact of the matter is you all are doing something we could never get away with. You are actually disappearing the Black population of Portland, Oregon." Basically, this white nationalist was pointing out that our inability to address historic and present day white supremacy makes us look like hypocrites, that it makes us unable to provide an alternative to the white nationalist vision of nihilism and violence and ethnic cleansing. It is critically important to understand that the most effective remedy to white nationalist violence and influence is a strong, inclusive democracy, one that is people-centered, accountable, and transparent, one that protects all of its community by ridding itself of discriminatory policies and shaping a circle that includes us all. But it's also important for us to understand the interplay between current institutions and movements, right? We have to understand that there is even disparate understanding of the threats. We have seen disparate treatment by law enforcement of protesters versus counter-protesters, in fines that have been levied. And what we understand is that white nationalism isn't often seen as a threat by our institutions, but has something that is akin to kind of I'm sorry, I'm searching for the word right now, but is akin to kind of a small disruption. Part of that has to do with the demographic makeup in Oregon. While the white nationalist movement may not appear to be very big when you are 80% of the population, meaning white Oregonians, when you are merely 20% of the population, meaning people of color and others, that white nationalist movement is much more significant, particularly when they are focused on harassing you. The solution to white nationalist violence, not only in Oregon, but around the country, is that those of us who think we aren't vulnerable need to speak up. We need to talk about this issue, and we need to demand that our elected officials and civic leaders speak up and draw a clear moral barrier against bigotry. Studying our history is a great way to get a feel for these shifting dynamics over time. We should also understand that white nationalism shapes our conversations. It shapes our fears and anxieties. It seeks to play off of them and to organize them in order to get us to do things unconsciously that we would never do or think of consciously. How do we counter that? We do so by closing space with one another. It means we reduce racial anxiety and other forms of demographic anxiety. We do that by doing things together. And in this moment where we are under a global pandemic, there is no better time to begin to build those communities with one another, to begin to cross those lines, to begin to know one another. And to understand the first times we do that, we will feel anxiety. We will feel uncomfortability being in spaces that aren't familiar with us. But the more we enter those spaces, the more familiar we will be with one another. And if we enter those spaces to do work together, to strengthen our own state, to strengthen democracy in our own state, to strengthen our ability to take care of one another during a global pandemic, there is no better training ground. So I really encourage people to think about ways that they can help and volunteer that put them right in spaces, even if it's virtual, with folks who aren't like you. That can be volunteering at the food bank. That can be virtual conversations, looking at issues that are happening in your community, right? That can be simply providing support for your neighbor. It is a critical time, not only in our country, but globally, and I'll end with this. We are in a moment in our society that is very akin to the 60s civil rights movement. When I was a kid, I used to play a game called If I Remember, I Remember When. Or sorry, I used to play a game called If I Were. And the game was like this. We'd just sit in a circle and we'd say, if I were in the middle of a lion's cage, here's how I would get out. Or if I was speeding down the freeway and the brakes went out, here's what I would do. And then we'd argue about what we would or wouldn't do as kids. The question that would come up every summer was, if I were in the midst of the civil rights movement, here is what I would do. Now, we would argue, and we didn't understand the choiceless choices of our parents and our grandparents. So we would talk about all kinds of things with bravado about what we would or wouldn't do and what we would put up with and what we wouldn't. But the truth is that question has always haunted me. What would I have done in the midst of the 60s civil rights movement? That question may haunt you too. What would you have done? Well, I'm here to close by telling you, you no longer have to wonder that. The truth is, whatever it is you would have done in the midst of the 1960 civil rights movement is likely what you will do when you get off this seminar. Make it count. Your agency matters in this moment. It's time for us to say, this is what it means to be an Oregonian. These are the values that we uphold. that we believe our circle is big. And we are about not drawing lines, but about expanding circles. It's time for our voices to be heard. And I look forward, next slide, to you all joining us or other organizations fighting for a strong, inclusive community in Oregon. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Eric. That was excellent. I've been tracking our comments on Facebook, and people are kind of starting to talk to one another a little bit towards the end there with your discussions about how people can get involved. So that's really excellent. We haven't had a ton of questions yet. So if anyone is out there listening and has some, please do add them to the live stream comments. But I will go ahead and start with a couple of comments that we've had so far. One of the comments that we had was that they appreciated learning that, quote, immigration is code for racism, and that it definitely feels that way, but this is a really handy shorthand for pushing back on that to other people. And so are there any other examples that you could give of ways that people can kind of question their own implicit biases that might help them in communicating with others then?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to understand that there's a lot of code words and dog whistle politics out there, right? And we have to begin to question, what does that mean? When we hear the word globalist, right? And when we hear the word immigration, when we hear the word terrorist, when we hear the word hired, you know, or thug, right? What do those really represent? And what's the context of the conversation that's happening? And it's important to continue to kind of devolve those contexts to kind of understand what folks mean, right? And I'll give you an example. It's not just on the right that those things happen, right? There are dog whistles and stereotypes that come from across the political spectrum, right, that we need to let go of. Things like rural-urban divide, right? The idea that somehow the majority of people who live in Oregon, right, who are in rural areas or in urban areas, experience something fundamentally different from one another. That is absolutely not true. Most people in Oregon, whether you are in urban areas or you're in rural areas, right, are concerned about jobs, are concerned about quality education, are concerned about good technological platforms that allow us to use the internet without net jam, right? Are concerned about the future of our children. The idea of the urban-rural divide is merely, right, a dog whistle that seeks to divide, right? And so what I tell folks is, if you hear language that appears to be drawing a line rather than a circle, you are beginning to probably stumble into some kind of code language or rhetoric. The goal of that is to dehumanize a part of our community, right? At a time where our community needs to be unified and aligned. We don't survive public health crisis, right, through division. We get out of these types of crisis, right, by aligning with one another and remembering the values that we have in common. This is not about Democrat or Republican. This is not about liberal or conservative, right? This is about inclusion versus exclusion. And most Oregonians hold the values of inclusion, and that's where we have to return to in our conversations. And so understanding those code words are critically important. And if I had time, I'd talk about how these code words have actually even served, right, to undermine the interest, right, of not just folks of color, right, but white folks as well. We all suffer when we are divided in this way.
Thank you. We did have just one quick question that hopefully this one won't take too long to answer because we've had one more come in. Someone was wondering if the Western States Center is allied with the Southern Poverty Law Center.
Yes, we worked very closely with the Southern Poverty Law Center, Anti-Defamation League, grassroots organizations. We work with a wide variety of civil rights organizations, human rights organizations, nationally and at the local level. I myself am a senior fellow of the Southern Poverty Law Center, so we work closely with them. We work closely with other organizations as well, including, we work with a broad set of grouping. We work with corrections officers, we work with faith leaders, we work with union members, we work with law enforcement, we work with grassroots community folks. Again, we are trying to expand the circle, not shrink it.
All right, I think we have time for one, maybe two more if another one comes in. Someone is asking, if we see another term of Trump, do you think white nationalism will stay the same? Or do you think that there could be even another surge and even more violence?
Yeah, so I think, I will say regardless of the outcome of the election, we are likely to see an upsurge of violence. We know that violence, the expression of violence parallels increase of bigoted rhetoric. We expect this campaign season to be full of bigoted rhetoric that will create a violence. It will create an enthusiasm and a space for violence. And we can expect the white nationalist movement to respond in kind, whether it is the re-election of Donald Trump, and they see it as an opportunity or a credentialing of their beliefs, or whether Donald Trump isn't re-elected and they see it as a defeat and then reach out react in violent frustration.
Okay, we have time for one more, and you kind of touched on this a little bit towards the end of your talk, but just in case you have anything to add. Someone was wondering, what is the best realm for white people who are allies to people of color who want to advocate for change? Is it through political activism, grassroots efforts, talking to our neighbors and families, probably all of the above?
Yeah, so I think, look, I'm gonna say all the above. I mean, join organizations like Western State Center or others, right, that may be interesting to you, right? But the other, it is personal. I don't want to give up that. There's power in personal relationship, and I think folks should start in their neighborhoods, right? We are in a moment where hundreds of thousands of Oregonians have lost their jobs. These are our neighbors, right? And I don't care if it is a 70-year-old white veteran in Eastern Oregon, right, or a 17-year-old trans Latina on the streets of Portland. Both of them are my neighbors. I don't care about their politics. I care that they have a roof over their heads. I care that they have food. I care that there's some future, right, for their children, right, and their children's children. And that is what we should all be caring about right now in Oregon, right? Not how we shout at each other, right? Not how we intimidate each other on the streets, but how do we take care of each other in the midst of a crisis, right? And this is a message for folks who, I'm a progressive, but for folks who aren't progressive, right? Who see themselves as on the right or staunchly conservative, right? We all have skills right now that can be put on the table, right? From, how to take care of ourselves to, how we get food to one another, right? How we build things, how we take care of one another. That's really the value in Oregon. That is why I call Oregon home, because we have always cared about how we take care of each other in our communities. And so we may not be able to do everything about the rest of the world right now or the rest of the country, but we can take care of each other. And I think we are all responsible to do that. And we have to stop allowing elected officials to manipulate and divide us right now. Get to know your neighbor. You should know everyone on your block.
Okay, I think that is a great way to end it and a great call for action. Get out there, get to know your neighbors, care for people. It's the least we can do right now. I'm really disappointed that we aren't together so that you can hear what I'm sure would be a huge round of applause for your talk tonight. It was excellent. We're so appreciative of you joining us virtually for this and for being our essentially our test subject to see how it goes. So thanks for being so gracious with that.